going to use. It has some wool in it, but it's not 100% wool, and it's very lightweight. We am attempting to do sort of an organza color, and as we go through the process we might end up giving her a really nice detail on the hem, but we can't be totally sure until we try it on Poet and we see how she likes it. So I recommend you get something wintry, either a lightweight wool, maybe velveteen, even pinwheel corduroy if it's lightweight, or a print that has some body that looks wintry. I've been wanting to make her a dress out of these tartan, so that's what I'm going to use. It's not so much this, I guess it's a little bit of a tartan, but it can also just be called plaid. So I'm using chalk pen to mark. Depending on your fabric, you can use disappearing ink marker, you can use heat erasable marker. These are the seam lines. And with plaids you have to be sure that you center it correctly. I am using this line. This is my center front line instead of these gold lines, and then I'll try to use these gold lines to match if I need to match any lines in the design. I am contemplating using these. It has pearls. I might use one center right here, or we can also do a bias strip, so put the plaid like this and make a mock button band here just to add some design to the front of the dress. Your pattern doesn't have seam allowance, so that you can blow it up, make it bigger without affecting the seam lines. So this is it. This bodice has quite a bit of ease, so it doesn't look too tight on her. To match plaid pieces, so for example this is the front and I drew where these gold lines are. So what I'm going to do is, now that I'm going to do the back, and I don't want to trace the back like this because there might be movement, so I'm going to trace each individual pieces, and I'm going to make sure that this line, so when I sew them together at the side seam, there's going to be a matching line right here, which is this one. So when I'm tracing this pattern, I have to make sure that I put the pattern right there, and I am just gonna try to find so that this line is straight. I can put it over there, and then that line is right there. This is my straight line, and I'm tracing the pattern, leaving myself seam allowance because the pattern is knit, so this is where I'm going to sew. So when I cut it, I need to cut it correctly so I have the seam allowance sorted out, or I can thread mark it and then doesn't matter the seam allowance because I will use a thread marking for my pinning. But since I'm not gonna do thread marking, I'm just gonna make sure that my seam allowance is even. So I have the sleeves here which are not lined, the front and the back which I haven't cut. This is the lining. So now I'm going to sew the fronts to the backs, both lining and exterior fabric, and then I can decide if I want to do some design here. I'm still debating. I think it would look pretty, very pretty if we had the plaid going this way instead of using the lace with the pearls. So I think I'm going to do that first. So the way I'm deciding is I want the plaid, the bias strip, to be up to here because this is my center front. So that gives me 2 inches width, and I need a piece that is the length of this, which is 5.5 inches. So I have an extra piece of fabric here, and I need to cut it on the bias. So with this is very simple. I just fold it like this so that I get the bias edge here. And since I'm going to have to fold the raw edges of the bias strip, I can't just cut an inch at the fold, which would give me a 2-inch strip. I need at least 1/4 inch to each side that I can fold under, and I need to make sure that this band is at least 5 inches. So it's good because I have about almost 7 inches. So let's say there I have 1.25 inch at the fold, and that should give me a nice bias strip. If you really wanted to, like, this is not an even plait, so I can't just like grab it like this to make sure that this, for example, these red ones are right where I want them. I could try to do that and just fold it there. See, I'm trying to keep these red. I want to see the angle that they're at. Yeah, they're at a 45-degree angle, so I can use this rectangles, the crosses of these red points, to make sure that this ones land right in the center of my strip. So that's what I'm going to do, and then I'm going to show you what it looks like. So here we go. I tried to center these diamonds. As you can see, it's not a very even plait, but then I can use this design and center my 5.5 inches over this. If I wanted this rectangle to be right on top of that one, then I can say, okay, that's where it's gonna go, right? And I can just trim the band. But first I'm going to fold it and see what a nice detail it has, that it breaks the plait of the front. It breaks it with the lines going crisscross. And so this is how I've decided to place it. I've ironed the raw edges under, so that's 1/4 inch on each side, and it's sitting within the 2 gold lines. I want this center diamond. I could center it right over the red band like this, so that this matches this line. And if I know that the color is gonna be, I'm gonna sew here, and this is my 1/4 inch seam allowance. It's going to be right at the point, right? So maybe I don't want it to be right there. Maybe I wanted to move it just a little bit, or maybe I want to move it a lot and match the red lines this way. If you want it, it's not even, so that's why, for example, this one won't match with this one, but it sort of looks a little bit like that. So that's up to you. I am going to put it somewhere over here so that this cross nearly matches this one's, but knowing that right there is going to be the seam allowance for when I saw the color in the lining. And so one thing you can do so that it doesn't move is that you baste it. Another one is that you pin it. Another one is that you fuse it. Whatever you want to do so that this stays put as you sew it right at this edge. You can hand sew it so that there's no seams. I am going to make a tiny little seam right around at the very edge. And I am going to pin it a lot so it doesn't move as I put it through the sewing machine. For the color, I have 2 layers of organza. I'm using the paper pattern, and I just draw that so that I knew which one. And I'm going to sew right here, then I'm going to turn right side out, and this is going to be one piece, and then I'll do the other one. we're going to use very lightweight fabric with no body at all. Here I have both colors. I sew them, I clip the seam allowance, I turn them right side out, and I press them. So now we're going to sew them. We're going to sew them right like this. Okay. You can overlap them a little bit so that when you do the seam, there's that space in between. So you're just going to overlap them a little bit. As you can see here, I've basted the color to the main fabric, and I've made a little mark exactly where I need to sew, which is right here, and that I marked it over here with these little thumbtacks, just so that I know that my seam has to go about 1/8 of an inch from my basting line all the way over here, so that then my color looks like this when I turn it right side out. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew the lining to the main fabric. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to trim the seam the lining, and then the first thing you're going to do is sew this too, and then you're going to sew the neckline. So first you're going to trim 1/4 inch from each long side at the back of the dress. Then you're gonna sew it, press the seam flat, and then you're going to match the raw edges, which is going to create a little fold on the exterior fabric, and then you can do this seam. Okay, once you do this seam and you open them, you might have to trim the seam allowance on the exterior fabric a little bit, because what you're going to do is match these raw edges right all around, and it's going to create a little loop here, extra fabric. So you're going to fold that like this. Okay, like that. You're gonna fold it, and then you're going to sew. But now what we have to do is we have to understitch the color to the lining. So we'll start somewhere here and understitch the seam allowances towards the lining, all like this, so that they help the color sit better. Here you can see I've put it like this through the machine, and I've understitched, stretching the lining, making sure this seam catches the seam allowances and sews them towards the lining. So now I'm going to press this and sew the sleeve to both layers. So this is where we are. I've sewn the collar, I've sewn the sleeves to both lining, and I have serged the edges, the raw edges, and then I've pressed from this side the seam allowance towards the sleeve. So now we can, at this stage, you can decide if you want a pretty sleeve, like a longer cuff, if you want to add lace, if you want to have a placket, whatever is that you like. I've decided to add cuffs with the same design detail as this. So I cut 2 strips 2.5 inches so that I can fold the cuff, right? And we are gonna sew it to this. If you want this to be like have movement because you feel that the doll is gonna struggle, don't interface it. If you're working with very lightweight fabric and you want the cuffs to look very sturdy, then interface it. There's no gathering here at all. It's just going to be a simple cuff, adding a detail. You could also add a bit of piping here so that it comes out of the cuff, so that when the cuff is like this, there's a little bit of a design detail over there. It's up to you. Okay, so I've decided what I'm going to do. I'm going to do, this is a 1-inch velvet ribbon. I'm going to fold it in half, and I'm going to sew it to the sleeve right here. My seam allowance came up as 3/8, and that makes a really pretty detail. So if you don't want it to be, if you don't want to eat 3/8 out of this, you can just sew it with 1/4 inch, trim the velvet. The point is that you want about this much of the velvet peeping out, about that much, right? And then, so first you're gonna sew it like this, looking up. The fold needs to be towards the sleeve, and then you're going to do this and sew it on top, and then you're gonna do that, and it's gonna look like this. I have trimmed the velvet now to 3/4 inch, so I'm going to fold it and sew it with the fold towards the sleeve head. So the fold goes towards the sleeve head. I'm gonna sew it to each sleeve first using 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then I'll sew the cuffs, fold it, and then I'll do the raw edges with the serger. I have the sleeves now with the cuff and the little velvet ribbon peeping out. So what I want to do is to reduce the bulk. I am going to trim the velvet a little bit more, and then I'm going to serge the raw edges of both the sleeve and the cuff together, enclosing the velvet inside the seam. So here is the bodice sewn. Serge the sleeve, made the seam, and then serged everything. And so now all we have to do is turn it right side out. And this is what the sleeve looks like. If you notice, this sleeve doesn't have much gathering here. You can make it gather a bit more, but now we have to press the seam allowance and press this flat, right? And then we're ready to sew the skirt. So we're trying our outfit on Poet to see how long should we make it, right? So the waist circumference on the dress, not hers, on the dress, is 14 inches so far. So we can double it, and it's going to be a very it's going to be a gathered dress, but not too fluffy. If we triple it, so 14 times 3 is going to have more body. So that's something that you can decide. You don't have to do it double, you can do it triple. And if your fabric is very lightweight, you can even multiply the bodice waist times 4, giving myself about 1/2 inch of seam allowance. I want her dress to be long, so for her it would be 10 inches plus 2 inches worth of hem. That would be 12. I'm going to cut a piece that is at least 12 inches this way, and then decide whether I want a double or a triple measurement at the waist. Now I've folded and pressed and folded again and pressed. I use the lines on the fabric to get me a little better. So this ended up being 2 inches and 1/16, and the underfold is about 3/8, a little bit more. So the finished length is going to be 9 3/4. Now you can do this seam on the sewing machine, to quickly finish it, especially if you have a thread that can be easily hidden. I am going to do it by hand because it goes from red to green to gold and I don't want the stitches to show. So I am going to sew this by hand so that there's no visible stitches on the right side of the fabric. So now I have my sewn in hem. It's all nice. I've made one row of gathering stitches at the top. I've marked the center, and now I've finished the raw edges on the sides. Now I'm gonna gather the top edge. I am going to sew it to the waist of the bodice, and I'm going to leave this like this so that I can have a nice finish edge and make a seam halfway through the skirt to close at the back. I was thinking of adding a design detail at the bottom with the same red velvet ribbon, but it's so thick that it would make the bottom of the skirt flare out too much, and this is 3 times the fabric, so I think it would look too weird. So I just left it simple like that. I wish I had either thinner ribbon or something a little bit more with less body than this white one, because this is too stiff, and if I sew it here you'll see the difference in this is double layer, this is single layer. If I sew it higher it looks nice, but it's going to make the fabric flare weird, and if I sew it too low it just doesn't look as nice. So I am gonna leave that on the side, and I'll just finish the skirt quite simple and show you once it's all done. And so we have the dress here almost finished. This is bottom. I've just pressed the seam allowance towards the bodice so that the gathers look a little bit nicer. I sew the skirt to the bodice and then I serge the raw edge. Now what I have to do is sew this. You can sew it by hand or in the sewing machine, and then you're gonna hide the threads in your last thing is gonna make a seam allowance, a seam here that matches the fold. So this would be a wider seam allowance, about 1/2 inch, so that the dress can overlap neatly like this, right? And then of course you can do buttons or snaps, and you can also add beads or buttons at the front or a big bow. How you decorate the dress is up to you. I am just going to do the back seam and then put it on Poet. I hope you like the tutorial and that you sew this dress, this beautiful winter dress for your doll.